Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's your host Rocco bringing you guys another album review. And today we're going to be soldiering on with the Genesis Marathon, marching forward with my Genesis album reviews as promised. And today's going to be a really special one. We're hitting one of the biggies here, guys. Selling England by the Pound from 1973, the fourth Genesis album. From Genesis to Revelation never happened. And this album here is just, what's there to say about this album? What the fuck is there to say about this album? It's widely considered one of the best albums of all time. And here I am attempting to review it like an idiot. And honestly, it really is one of the best albums of all time. It's probably my second or third favorite Genesis album. I gotta say Foxtrot, the one before this, I think it's forever going to be my favorite just by a little bit. But Selling England by the Pound is literally just as good, if not objectively better than Foxtrot. Like, from an objective point of view, this might be the epitome of progressive rock music. I mean, it's number 2 on ProgArchives.com, second only to Close to the Edge by Yes, which is probably the best album ever. That's a debate for another day. But come on, to be number 2 on Prog Archives. I mean, Prog Archives literally has, it's a huge database of every progressive rock band, every progressive rock album ever made, all the reviews, all the ratings, rated by fans and shit, and this is number 2. So, this is going to be tough to review because it's so good, it gets so much praise, and everyone just seems to, rave and rant about this album. So what's the point of even reviewing it? Well, honestly, guys, to be honest, I just want to. I feel like reviewing this album. I feel like I have a lot to say about it. I've been listening to it for so many years, and it's just had such a profound impact on my life. It was just such a milestone album. When I heard this for the first time, I was never the same. I mean, this is literally a life-changing musical experience. And this was actually the first Genesis album I'd heard. I was never into... I'd heard Genesis songs on the radio at this point, the hits from the 80s. But when I was 14 years old, just going into grade 9, my local radio station, Q107, was actually doing a series on Genesis. And the first song I heard on that series was Firth of Fifth, one of the greatest progressive rock songs of all time from this album, and ever. And The Fountain of Salmacis from the album Nursery Crime. And I was immediately sucked in. I'm like, what is this fantastic music? This is Genesis? I thought Genesis was the band that sang Land of Confusion and things like that. And I was blown away, and I'm still blown away. And now, after all these years of listening to it, I guess it's been almost 10 years now, 9 years of just listening to this album more than I would care to admit, because it would kind of sound weird if I admitted how many times I've heard this album. Kind of an OCD, an obsessive compulsive thing. But I've heard it, let's say I've at least heard it hundreds of times. No exaggeration. I feel like I have a lot to say about it. And I just love chatting with you progressive rock people. I mean, we love the music. We don't just listen to an album and then throw it away. No, we listen to it, we absorb it, we enjoy it. And I just really want to just gush about how much I love this album amongst friends. We're all friends here. We're all in the rock and metal and progressive rock community. And maybe give you guys some insights and some opinions that you might not have considered about it. So, thanks for watching the video. If you have the patience to watch it, I'm sure it's going to be a long-ass review because I have so much to say about it. Look, I got all these notes written so I don't forget. Fucking so much shit, because there's just so much I want to say about the album. And without further ado, I guess let's just start off with some of the backstory. So where were Genesis at this point? So this is 1973, okay, the height of the progressive rock movement. I mean, some say probably 72 to 74 were the peak progressive rock years. And I've always been pissed off that the progressive rock movement didn't last longer. But in recent years, there seems to be a nice little resurgence going on. If you check out my last few reviews, you'll see that there have been some pretty awesome progressive rock albums in the past year, which is amazing. But yeah, this is the height of the classic progressive rock, the classic symphonic progressive rock movement. And this album here really, I don't want to say it exemplifies the progressive rock sound, because it sounds so unique. and it's so unique even within the Genesis discography. I mean, they didn't write an album like this before, and they didn't write an album like this after. It's unique. I would say Foxtrot is like the perfect summary of what British symphonic progressive rock was at the time. And this is just something totally different. It's just something so unique, so creative. And I honestly say it doesn't exemplify what progressive rock sounded like at the time. It's just because it just sounds so unique. But that's the beauty of progressive rock. Every band, every album in the same band sounded totally different. But if I had to point to an album that kind of unified all the themes of progressive rock at the time, it would be Foxtrot. So that's like the definitive Genesis album. This one here, it goes a little bit, it goes further, it reaches further into like more obscure musical inspirations. But we'll get into that later. So back to the history. I'm going on a tangent here, guys. I always go on tangents. I'm going on a tangent about going on a tangent right now. That's how fucked up I am. Sorry, I'm getting a little excited about the album. But, so it's 1973. They had just went on a lengthy tour. They finally toured North America, finally cracked into the North American scene, which was awesome because Genesis music is not derivative of North American music whatsoever. I mean, this is British progressive rock. This was its own thing, its own European thing, not derivative of American music. And they made a little bit of a splash in America, you know, like with their, I was explaining that in the last video, that Peter Gabriel's, stage presence with his crazy costumes, his eccentric pre-song introductions, really started getting the word going about Genesis. Like, hey, check these guys out. They're fucking crazy. And they were touring, really honing their chops. And when they finished the tour, they went back to England, and it was time to record a new album, as was the norm at the time. Like, you would tour for like a couple months to a year, record a new album, and just go back on tour and rinse and repeat. And that was the norm at the time. Now you have bands like, you write an album, you go on tour for 3-4 years, Metallica, and fucking you get like 2-3 albums a decade, which is so unsatisfying. But anyway, that's another tangent. So they went back to the studio, and they really had nothing. They didn't really have any new material. They were kind of strapped for ideas because they were too busy touring, too busy putting on this elaborate show to promote Foxtrot. And they had a few bits here and there. They had a riff that Steve Hackett had been working on, which ended up becoming I Know What I Like from this album. And they had these 3 parts that Tony Banks had come up with that he actually had presented to the band for Foxtrot, but they all rejected him, ironically, because it's Tony Banks. He usually has the last word in Genesis, but, So that later became Firth of Fifth, which is considered the monumental track on this album. So they didn't really have too much shit in the bag. So what did they do? They went to the record company, Charisma Records, and Tony Stratton Smith at the time, he was really happy with the band. He loved Foxtrot. He thought it was one of the best albums ever. And he said, you know what, guys? Take all the time you want. I'm going to give you 3 months just to write the album. Like, just to literally come up with the songs on this album. Not even recording, just to write the album. And at the time, that was unheard of. To think that the Beatles had to, like, write and record their albums in, like, a week or, like, a couple days. Their first album, Please Please Me, for God's sake, man. That was 1 day to record. So to think that not even 10 years later, a record company's giving a band this much freedom, it's just incredible. So that was extremely generous. So they went into the studio. They were trying to... Foxtrot did really well. Went to number 12 on the UK charts. And that was really impressive. So, like, I guess they were kind of pressured to come up with a follow-up to that. And they went into the studio, and these guys were like perfectionists. Not like Steely Dan level perfectionists when it came to like the sound quality, but compositional perfectionists. Because they would just rework and rearrange and restructure all their ideas. Kind of like the opposite of Neil Young. Because when you hear about Neil Young, that guy was crazy. He would do shit on 1 take, just write a song in a few minutes and record it and slap it on the album. But no, Genesis was extremely anal. They would get an idea, rework it. All 5 members of the band would try to like sprinkle a little bit of their creativity onto it. And it was just because they had all the time in the world. They had 3 months to write an album, which was crazy. So, you know, the band said those times in the studio were a little bit frustrating because they would have to rework and rehash everything to like be perfectionists, I guess. And they really came up with too many ideas in this at this point. And that 3 month time frame that the record company gave them really was kind of long. They came up with like too many ideas that they knew what to do with, and they were always arguing like, "No, I want my part on the album. No, I want my part on the album." And they couldn't decide what to do, so they literally just released all they had onto a 53-minute magnum opus that is Selling England by the Pound. So, you know, that tight quality control that they had in the past, where like a lot of stuff got rejected, a lot of people's things got rejected in terms of like the in favor of like the more group compositions. This one kind of, the quality control kind of suffered a bit because they kept arguing and they really had to compromise and throw everything they had in the kitchen sink onto this album. So you would think that this album would kind of suck because, like, you know, there was no quality control. But at this point, it was a relatively stable and a relatively creative point in Genesis's career. And they were just, after touring for these last few years, they were young, impressionable. They picked up a lot of influences. That this album ended up being a fucking masterpiece. Like, it was incredible. Every single track on this album, with the exception of maybe one or two songs, is just a freaking masterpiece, in my opinion. So, even though the quality control department did kind of suffer, whatever slipped through the cracks was good enough, because this album, just to be considered the #2 greatest progressive rock album, really has to have something up its sleeve. So, so that's pretty much the backstory. So they recorded the album, they released it. It was met with like some pretty great reviews. I mean, John Lennon, he loved the album apparently, and that gave the band a lot of confidence. They went out on tour again, put on an extremely elaborate show called The Dark Show. It was like a glow-in-the-dark kind of thing. Really elaborate stage show for this album. And it was great. Like, the band was just really like progressing forward. And so what was another few like important historical developments pertaining to this album were that Tony Banks purchased a lot of new keyboards, a lot of new synthesizers at the time. And it really opened the door to like a lot of new possibilities. So that was like a major improvement on, or development on this album. And also that Steve Hackett and Phil Collins were becoming very influenced by jazz fusion. So that had another huge impact on the album. So I'd say those were the two major turning points. Otherwise, Genesis, it was a relatively stable period. There were no major drastic changes in the lineup or drastic changes in any shift in tone with the band. So there's not much to say about the history other than that 3-month time period kind of gave them like a little too much to work with. And, you know, that's kind of unheard of to write a 55-minute album at the time, single LP. That's just ridiculous. To cram that much music onto a single LP was unheard of. And they do say like the sound quality kind of suffered a bit because of all that crap going on to the album. But I listened to the remastered version, so I don't have to deal with any of that bullshit. So I'm happy about that. So yeah, now that we talked about kind of the history, kind of the backstory of this album, let's dive into the sound, dive into the overall atmosphere, the overall concept, and the overall review of Selling England by the Pound. So what is it about Selling England by the Pound that makes it such a unique and creative album in Genesis's discography? I mean, what sets it apart from Foxtrot? Because think about it, Foxtrot only came 1 year back, and now we're in 1973, and Genesis is producing this behemoth that sounds completely different. You might like Foxtrot better. Like, personally, I mentioned Foxtrot's probably my favorite Genesis album. But you can't deny that Genesis had progressed forward with Selling England by the Pound. And that's the beauty of Genesis. They just kept progressing forward. So I think the best way to review this album is just to compare it to Foxtrot and see what makes this album so different. Like, what new elements are they bringing to the album? What's the atmosphere of the album? And just what is it? What is the essence of this album? And that's going to be hard because there's so many details and there's so many building blocks that go into this album that give it its unique sound. Because you have Foxtrot. It's your quintessential progressive rock album. I mean, if you want to hear a quintessential album that just basically summarizes everything about early 70s symphonic progressive rock, you go to Foxtrot. I mean, you got the big Mellotron chords. You got like the lengthy in-your-face keyboard solos, the flourishes, the epic build-ups, the fantasy lyrics. You got like the sidelong epic with Supper's Ready. I mean, everything about like 70s progressive rock is just perfected on Foxtrot. So they already did that. And then where do you go from there? You have to completely change your motivation, your direction, and just do something completely different. And that's exactly what Genesis did. So I just like to start off by talking about like the concept and some of like the thematic aspects of Selling England by the Pound that distinguish it from their previous albums. So if you watch my previous reviews, you'll know that Genesis really, I love their lyrics because they're so quirky and unique and just fantasy inspired. And this album is definitely has a different tone because it's kind of like a concept album. And not in the sense of a concept album like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, where it's like a rock opera, where it's based on this one storyline and like there's a protagonist and an antagonist, and they go on an adventure and like all this crazy shit happens. It's not like that. It's more of a thematic concept album. And the theme here being British culture, and particularly like the commercialization and Americanization of British culture. I mean, the title itself, Selling England by the Pound, was based on a Labour Party slogan, which was a left-wing leaning party in England at the time. And that concept alone is already like holy shit, how did they go from writing fantasy lyrics about giant hogweeds and like croquet mallet decapitation and fucking the four horsemen of the apocalypse and things like that into going into like a social commentary on British culture. And to be fair, it's just really the opening track, Dancing with the Moonlit Knight, that focuses on the commercialization aspect of it. Oh, and of course the Isle of Plenty, the last song on the album. That gives the album a nice bookend effect. But everything in the middle, all the songs in the middle kind of deal with like other different aspects of British culture. Like for example, the Battle of Epping Forest is about a chain gang fight, like about rival British chain gangs that would fight in this suburb called Epping Forest in London, which is very British, very quirky. And then you got the hit track, the hit single, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, which is kind of about like English expectations of a young man at the time, and like how, you know, you have this dude who's really not making much of his life, and it applies to every culture, not just British, but it definitely has that like British tone, that British atmosphere. And you look at like that Betty Swanwick cover, and it's just probably the best album cover up to this point. Okay, maybe Nursery Crime was probably like my favorite, but this one here artistically is definitely the best. And it just gives you like it feels like you're listening to like a real work of art, because you got the album cover and you listen to the music, and when you put it together, it creates this really classical effect. That's the only way I can describe it. This classical, kind of like you're listening to a more mature album. So thematically, it's a lot more mature. And there's a lot of literary references, a lot of like Greek mythology references that kind of like go over your head the first time you hear it. But props to a lot of the British reviewers that have reviewed this album. Like, for example, Darren Locke and his famous Prague review series, which is amazing, by the way. But those British reviewers really go in depth with all like the literary and British references that might go over your head. I'm an Italian Canadian guy. How the fuck am I supposed to understand this shit? So those reviews really help. So if you want an in-depth analysis, I definitely suggest checking out a British progressive rock reviewers video, and you'll get the scoop on all like the inside references and allusions and literary bullshit, basically, which is amazing. So my point is, it definitely has a more mature feel thematically compared to their previous albums, which were more like lighthearted and fantasy inspired. This album definitely has that aspect of social commentary, that aspect of realism, modernism that you don't get in the other Genesis albums, and it just creates a unique atmosphere in that sense. And Peter Gabriel, props to this guy. He wrote all his lyrical contributions in 2 days, apparently. And the lyrics on this album are freaking phenomenal. I mean, the Battle of Epping Forest alone is just like a lyrical, just maze of craziness. And then you got Dancing with the Moonlit Knight with its, come on, there's lines like, it seems, old Father Thames, it seems he's drowned. You know, Father Thames representing like the Thames River in London. And, you know, just the title of the album itself, Selling England by the Pound. Just some of the greatest Peter Gabriel lyrics. I think on the next album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, that would be the peak of his lyrical prowess. But on Selling England, he does a damn good job. So it's amazing how he came up with his lyrics in 2 days. And of course, Tony Banks wrote a couple lyrics here and there, Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford. But the majority of the lyrics were penned by Peter Gabriel. So it's just, that amazes me, man, how he wrote those lyrics in only 2 days. So lyrically and conceptually, very different from Foxtrot. Now let's get into what I really want to talk about, the instrumentals. So what makes the instrumentation and the actual music different? Well, there's a few things, so let me break it down for you. So the first thing you're going to notice is it definitely has more of a jazz fusion-y sound to a lot of the songs. I mean, there's intricate time signatures, some like weird, like just, it feels like jazzy, like free-form jazzy improvisations, especially on Dancing with the Moonlit Knight and like later on the cinema show. Just definitely a very, you know, jazzy feel to it, musically, very complex. And the band is extremely tight. I mean, after the Foxtrot tour, I had mentioned in the previous video how after Nursery Crime, they got so much tighter as a band. But after Foxtrot, that's when they really put the finishing touches, when all the members of the band were at the top of their game, especially Phil Collins. I mean, the guy's a fucking madman on this album. His drumming on Selling England is, whoo! It's just, it's mind-blowing, especially on the second half of the cinema show. And it's just, you know, so it has that jazzy feel that you don't really get on Foxtrot. But I'm not saying it's a jazzy album. Like, it's not jazz, like in the sense of Steely Dan, just literally like keeping rock as your foundation and just throwing jazz over it. Like, no, it's just more of like the spirit of jazz, like more of like the free-form nature of it that really prevails on this album. So that's one thing. Another thing is they really let the instrumentals breathe on this album. And I mean, you could argue that they did on Foxtrot as well. I mean, you got Apocalypse in 9/8, which is like this crazy keyboard solo. And you got the whole second half of Can Utility and the Coastliners. But it's totally different. I mean, on this album, you have long, long stretches of instrumentation. I mean, the cinema show, the last song on the album, it's basically like a fucking 6-minute like keyboard and drum extravaganza. And then Firth of Fifth, it's a 9-minute song and probably like 90% of it is instrumental. And even on Dancing with the Moonlit Knight, you got some like huge chunks of instrumentals, like the fade out at the end, the instrumental track itself after the ordeal. I mean, they really let the instrumental sections really breathe on this album and take their time to develop, which also gives it that mature sound. Like, you're listening to it and you're like, oh my god, listen to how that's evolving and developing. And whereas on Foxtrot, nothing against it, the instrumentals were like bam, like in your face, like we're gonna fucking throw this keyboard solo at you, not Apocalypse in 9/8, here it comes, bitch, and they just go nuts. And then the ending of Can Utility and the Coastliners with those epic time changes, here they really like take their time and they reach those heights, but they really take their time to get there and like let it breathe and develop. And you listen to it and you feel like, this is really like enveloping, you know. So a lot of people think that, you know, a lot of people consider that superior to Foxtrot, and it's just a matter of preference. But yeah, so that's definitely an objective reason why this might be a better album than Foxtrot. So musically, they really let the instrumentals breathe. And I mentioned the jazz influence, but the classical influence is also much stronger on this album compared to previous albums. I mean, you got Tony Banks with the classical piano just, you know, going nuts all over this album. And it definitely has like more of that classic feel to it, which is really cool. So you're combining the modern jazzy instrumentals with the classical feel, and that creates like a unique dichotomy right there in and of itself. So that's really, really cool. And speaking of Tony Banks keyboards, that's another difference between Foxtrot and this album. Tony Banks, he actually went out and he purchased all these new keyboards, all these new synthesizers that just really expanded the possibilities of what he can do on the instrument. I mean, he bought a new Mellotron with the choir effect, and he must have loved this shit because he used the hell out of this choir effect on the album, and it gives it like a grand and epic feel, especially on tracks like the Cinema Show and Dancing with the Moonlit Night. You got these choirs in the background. It just gives it this whole other epic feel. And all these synthesizers too. He bought all these synthesizers with like a totally different sound. So it gives the album this futuristic and more of like a modern tone to it compared to the other albums that relied on like the older Mellotrons, the older pianos. And it's just another great contrast between the classical elements of the album. Because you have the classical piano and the classical instruments, but you also have these modern synthesizers. And it's just fantastic. I mean, Tony Banks, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but like what he does with the synthesizer is just perfect. Because a lot of like the progressive rock keyboard players, I find that they go a little bit too crazy with the synthesizers. Like, for example, Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Even Rick Wakeman, who I fucking love. Like, they go a little too overboard with like the synthesizers. But Tony Banks, what he does with it, just perfectly suits the song, and it's interesting to listen to. I mean, it's just awesome what he does with the synthesizer. I mean, I don't know. I can't really describe what I'm trying to say, but he really does a great job with the synthesizers. So yeah, Tony Banks. And oh my God, another huge difference between this and the other albums is Steve Hackett. So Steve Hackett really contributes to this album. I mean, this is Steve Hackett's showcase, okay? I mean, he just shines on this album. And I mean, Nursery Crime as well. You know, no, I gotta give Nursery Crime credit. Steve Hackett really shines on Nursery Crime. But on Foxtrot, he kind of like sat in the backseat and let the keyboards and the other instruments kind of take center stage. But on this album, he really shines. And the ironic thing is, he didn't come to the album with a lot of like ideas for songs, a lot of like fully formed compositions. He really just came to the album just listening to the compositions and thinking, oh, where can I put my guitar parts to just elevate the songs? And that's exactly what he did, you know, because apparently his first marriage was breaking down, and he didn't have time to write like fully formed songs. So that's really what he did. He just took the compositions and found the perfect moments to add his parts. Perfect example is the first to fifth guitar solo. I mean, we all know and love this guitar solo. It's definitely like one of the greatest solos of all time, if not the best. And Steve Hackett just totally transforms that song from a fantastic song to a fucking masterpiece, okay? That song is Steve Hackett's just powerhouse song. And I mean, he's all over the album. I mean, on Dancing with the Moonlit Night, he's all over the place with his tapping technique. And it's just incredible, like how much texture he adds to the album. It's no wonder why this is his favorite Genesis album. But Tony Banks really does dominate a lot too. So it's a shocker, because apparently he's not a huge fan of Selling England, and so is Mike Rutherford. Go figure. Like, fuck off, guys. This is one of the best Genesis albums. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just basing that on their reissue interviews from 2007. So I don't know if like they still feel the same way, but it seems like whenever they talk about Selling England by the Pound, it's always like a little bit negative. And then Steve Hackett and Phil Collins are always like praising it and shit. So I don't know. To each their own. It's loved by everyone else. So I don't know, guys. Like, what don't you see in the album that everyone else does? It's a mystery. But yeah, so Steve Hackett was definitely like a major part of what makes this album so great. So, I don't know, hopefully I did a good job of explaining the difference between this and the other album. Just to summarize, you got like the whole new keyboard sound, you got the classical elements, the jazz elements, the extended song structures with the instrumental sections that breathe. You got the more mature thematic concepts, the more mature lyrics, and just creating all combining to create a totally different atmosphere. And even structurally, the album is strange as hell. I mean, you have 4 epic songs that are more or less 10 minutes. And the interesting is, the first song, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, and the Cinema Show were supposed to be one long 20-minute song. But they actually separated it because they didn't want fans to compare it to Supper's Ready and say, oh, it's so much worse than Supper's Ready. Because really, it would have been a totally different kind of 20-minute song, and I guess they had already done the 20-minute concept back on Foxtrot, and they didn't want to repeat that. So that's pretty cool. Like, I respect them for that, but I wouldn't have complained if they made it like a long ass 20-minute track. So yeah, you got these 4 epic length songs, which is great, and then you have all these other songs just like thrown in there. A notable example is "I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe." It was their first hit single. I mean, it wasn't a hit single. It didn't make them a household name, but at that point, it was like their poppiest and most popular single, basically. So that was nice for the band. And then you got like a weird classical instrumental called "After the Ordeal." You got and then you got "More Fool Me," which is the song that probably shouldn't have been on the album. I like the song, but it doesn't fit into the album thematically and instrumentally. It's just this weird like 70s love song that Phil Collins sings that they just threw in there. Anyway, that's the weird one on the album. If that was taken out, the album would have more of like a nice flow to it. So definitely a different structure than Foxtrot, which had like the sidelong epic. So that's my rant on the album overall. Now we're going to get into the track-by-track reviews where I nerd out on all the specifics of what I love about each song. And hopefully I did a decent job of just explaining the overall atmosphere of the album. Because it's just so unique, and words really don't do it justice. So go out right now and just listen to the album because it's just phenomenal.
Can you tell me where my country lies? Said the unicorn to his true love's eyes. It lies with me, cried the Queen of Maybe. For her merchandise, he traded in his prize.
So kicking off the album, we have the masterpiece, the absolute masterpiece, Dancing with the Moonlit Knight. And this really kind of acts as the title track of the album because not only does he mention the phrase selling England by the pound, but it's just, conceptually speaking, it really is the kind of like the lifeblood of the album. It has all the concepts of the consumerism, all like the British references, everything that goes into the concept of the album is in this first track. And this is definitely one of the greatest Genesis songs. If not like number 2 or number 3, definitely in the top 5. And I'm sure no one would disagree with that. It's actually Steve Hackett's favorite Genesis song, so that's saying a lot. And it's just magnificent. I mean, everything about it is just perfection. I mean, absolute musical perfection. And there's, I'd say, 3 songs on this album that are absolute musical perfection. Like right up there with Supper's Ready, right up there with The Musical Box. Absolute stone cold classics. And I mean, I'm going to dissect the song a little bit now, but just keep in mind that it acts as a cohesive piece. And clocking in at around 8.5 minutes, it's the shortest of the 4 epic tracks on the album, but definitely one of the strongest. I mean, all 4 of these epic tracks, it's like a coin toss which one's the best. Like, they're all pretty much equal. They're all pretty much amazing. Well, maybe except for the Battle of Epping Forest, but the other 3 are all on par. And I mean, what makes this song just so classic? Let's start with the intro. You got Peter Gabriel singing a cappella, and his voice on this section is probably his greatest vocal performance in Genesis, in my opinion. I mean, he reached some really high emotional heights on As Sure as Eggs is Eggs, which is the first part of Supper's Ready. But on this, like on the intro of this song, just starting it off with his voice a cappella is just so touching, so emotional, so evocative, and probably his strongest vocal performance. And I mean, no Genesis song had ever done this, except for going way back to Trespass with Looking for Someone, starting with the a cappella vocals. So they revisited it for Dancing with the Moonlit Knight and just improved on it leaps and bounds. I mean, it's amazing. And the guitar in the background, that little guitar riff, the which is kind of the main riff of the song if you think about it. It was actually developed by Peter Gabriel on the piano. So Peter Gabriel really did have a really strong hand in creating the kind of backbone of the song. And soon enough, the classical piano comes in, and it feels like a full-on classical piece of art. Very folksy, very British. Again, I've mentioned the line, the note was signed, old Father Thames, it seems he's drowned, selling England by the pound. And I think that's just one of the most effective lines on the album. Just so evocative, using Father Thames as a kind of metaphor for old school British society. And it just kind of makes me feel kind of patriotic, to be honest. And I'm not British. I'm Italian Canadian. And it makes me feel patriotic. So the song's definitely doing something right. I mean, like, it really, really is. And it's just, it's fantastic. And Peter Gabriel's voice on this section, just, it builds and builds. And that piano in the background just gives it this classical flair. I'll never forget the first time I heard this song. It was unlike anything I've ever heard. It was the most classical inspired piece I'd heard at that point. And honestly, like, this is going to sound really big-headed of me, but it made me feel like really smart, really like superior than like what my friends were listening to at the time. I'm like, damn, I'm listening to some classical music. And now I appreciated that the classical tone was just a part of progressive rock at the time. But at the time, it just felt like, you know, this was like the apex of music. And I mean, soon enough, the guitar kicks in, and man, it enters this part where Peter Gabriel's singing, "Young man says you are what you eat well." And it has this like groove to it. And the classical keyboard is kind of gone at this point. And Peter Gabriel's vocals, again, when he says, he has like a squeak in his voice when he says the word well. And that's so quirky. And you would think that that's a vocal flaw, but it gives the song so much character. And he has a warble in his voice, kind of like a little warble when he says the word damn. You know what you are, you don't give a damn. And I can't do it, but it just, those little quirks in his voice are just so awesome, so freaking epic. And then all of a sudden, the choir comes in with the Mellotron setting, as I was talking about before. And it's just, oh my God, it's just so epic. Words cannot even describe how epic this part of the song is. And then that chorus comes in with the dance right out through the night. And the choir's going full force, and it's just, it gets you really emotional. I mean, it's just fantastic. And then all of a sudden, the song completely changes, and this heavy riff comes in. And this jazz fusion guitar solo comes in with the jazziest, most complex drumming you can ever imagine playing in the background. And I mean, this is the jazz fusion part I was talking about. It went from classical, kind of folk, classic British inspired intro into this crazy jazz fusion jam. And it's just ridiculous. One of Steve Hackett's most memorable guitar solos. It has everything. The finger tapping, just the sheer intensity of it is beyond belief. And it's just so fusiony. And then all of a sudden, after the solo, the choir comes back in, and Peter Gabriel singing, "There's a battle raging outside the saloon." And I think that's the high point of the song. That's like the apex of the emotional component of the song. And again, the chorus comes in with the dance right out through the night, and just ridiculous. And then this kind of Steve Hackett playing like a sitar sounding guitar part, and then later on in the song it sounds like he's playing through a fuzz box. Just gives it this quirky, like, only Steve Hackett could come up with stuff like this. And did I mention Phil Collins' drumming throughout this entire section is just, I can't even describe how complicated and complex it is. But it's just ridiculous. And then the song just fades out with this gentle acoustic passage, which they call Disney, and it has some amazing Peter Gabriel flute playing, some classic Mellotron, and of course you got the 12-string guitars, which at this point was just a staple of Genesis that just fades out the song so beautifully. And it's just the perfect song. It's literally perfection, musical perfection. And it's ironic because Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, they both love the intro of the song with the a cappella section and then the build-up. But then when that Steve Hackett section comes in with the jazz fusion, they call it a little bit too busy, which I think is complete bullshit. I mean, this section of the song is what really makes the song as special as it is. And without Steve Hackett, the song will be great, but it would just kind of sound like a standard Genesis song. Steve Hackett and Phil Collins really elevated the song and gave it a modern twist with the jazz fusion-y sections. So before I go on for like 12, 13 minutes, however long I go on for. I just gotta say, Dancing with the Moonlit Knight is a 10 out of 10, hands down. Probably up to this point, the second or third best Genesis song, right before Supper's Ready and the Musical Box. So definitely one of the best, and a strong contender for best song on the album.